Okay, let's dive right in. We're talking about the one event that you could say kick-started the entire European age of discovery and launched a global empire. But get this, it didn't start with some famous explorer or a legendary voyage across the ocean. Nope, it all started with an invasion. So you gotta ask, right? How on earth did this happen? How did Portugal, a pretty small kingdom on the very edge of Europe, just fresh off making peace with its only neighbor, suddenly manage to project its power across the sea and, completely change the course of history? Well, the whole thing hinges on the conquest of a single city. Just one. But it was a strategic, it was a violent, and it was a meticulously planned move. And it turned out to be the very first step in a centuries-long story of expansion. Okay, so that brings us to the big question, right? Why Ceuta? Of all the places in the world they could have gone, what was so special about this one North African port?
Ceuta was, without a doubt, the key. Think about its location. It's sitting right at the mouth of the Mediterranean. It was this massive commercial hub, the end of the line for the trans-African caravans carrying all that Sudanese gold. It was a marketplace for precious spices. Oh, and on top of all that, it was a safe haven for pirates who were constantly raiding the Portuguese coast. So capturing Ceuta, that wasn't just another move on the chessboard, it was checkmate.
And here's what's so fascinating. This whole invasion wasn't driven by just one thing. It was this perfect storm of motives. You had the economic angle, for sure. They wanted that gold trade. Then there's the political angle, a major power play against their rivals, Castile. And socially, well, the Portuguese nobility was getting kind of restless. They needed something to do, new lands to conquer, new glory to win. And you can't forget the religious drive. This was all seen as a continuation of the Christian Reconquista, just on a new continent. A perfect storm, really. All right, so they've got their target. But think about this. How do you get a massive invasion force together without tipping off the entire world? That's the tricky part, right? And the way they pulled it off, it required a whole other level of genius. The plan that King Juan I cooked up was just brilliant. Total deception. First, he avoids levying new taxes to keep his own people from getting suspicious. Smart. Then he sends a fake diplomatic mission to Sicily, but its real purpose was to stop off in Ceuta and scout its defenses. The spies come back, and they secretly draw out the city's layout for the king, using sand and string. And for the grand finale, he picks a public fight with Holland, making all of Europe think his giant fleet is actually heading north. Just incredible misdirection. But then, right as this incredible plan is about to kick off, tragedy strikes. The plague hits Lisbon, and the queen, Philippa of Lancaster, gets really, really sick. On her deathbed, she calls her sons, the guys who are about to lead this whole expedition, and she gives each of them these beautiful, blessed, jewel-encrusted swords. And her last words, they were a blessing for their voyage. She even told them the north wind had arrived, which was perfect for the journey south to Africa. So, after a day of mourning, the fleet finally set sail. We're talking over 200 ships, packed with tens of thousands of soldiers. All that secrecy, all that planning, it all came down to this one day of battle, the assault on Ceuta itself. The scale of this invasion force was just staggering for the 15th century. Portugal had scraped together around 50,000 men and 200 ships. They even had mercenaries from England, France, and Germany. Pretty much every major noble family in the kingdom was there. So you can just imagine them arriving off the coast of Ceuta, this massive, seemingly unstoppable armada. And yet for all that power, you want to know how many Portuguese men were killed during the actual taking of the city? 8. That's it. Just 8 men. So how is that even possible? Well, after a few false starts because of bad weather, the city's defenders, who were a mix of the official garrison and civilian volunteers, they kind of thought the threat had passed. They relaxed. So when the Portuguese finally launched their real attack on August 21st, they were met with surprisingly little resistance. The city fell in a single day, and the looting that followed was absolute chaos. The chronicler Zurara wrote that the soldiers, in their frenzy to find gold, were just slashing open bags of spices, covering the streets with cinnamon and cloves. He says the smell, mixed with the intense heat of the sun, was just overpowering. What a wild image, right? It perfectly captures both the insane wealth of the city and the sheer violence of its capture. But here's the thing. Capturing the prize was actually the easy part. The conquest was over, sure, but an empire's very difficult birth had just begun. Now Portugal had to face the much, much harder challenge of actually holding on to what they'd taken. A lot of the king's own nobles just wanted to loot the city and bail. They saw it for what it was, an indefensible outpost completely surrounded by enemies. But the king was insistent they were going to hold it. The only problem was finding someone willing to stay. I mean, several high-ranking nobles flat out refused the job, until finally one man, Pedro de Menezes, stepped up and volunteered for the incredibly dangerous post of governor. And it turns out the nobles' fears were spot on. The city that was supposed to be this incredible source of wealth, it immediately became an enormous drain. Even Infante Pedro, who was one of the biggest cheerleaders for the invasion, admitted later in a letter that Ceuta was just a pit, swallowing up Portuguese men, weapons, and money.
So let's zoom out a bit and look at the real price of this conquest and the really complicated legacy that it left behind for centuries.
You know, holding the city was just a constant, brutal struggle. The Portuguese had to fight off a massive siege just a few years later. Then, an attempt to expand out from Ceuta and take Tangier ended in a humiliating disaster and even got a royal prince captured. And then, in the final ironic twist, when Portugal eventually regained its independence from Spain hundreds of years later, the city of Ceuta decided, nah, we're going to stay with Spain. And it's still Spanish to this day. And this really gets to the heart of it, the huge gap between the dream and the reality. The promise was controlling the African gold trade, but the merchants just moved their caravan routes over to other cities. The promise was a rich, self-sustaining prize, but the reality was a costly military fortress that constantly needed more men and more money from Portugal. It was a victory, yeah, but one that came with a price tag that was way higher than anyone had ever imagined. Which leaves us with a final, fascinating question. Was Ceuta a strategic failure that just bled Portugal dry for generations? Or was it the psychological victory that lit the fuse? The first crucial step that, despite all the cost, gave a small kingdom and its ambitious princes, like a young Henry the Navigator who fought there, the foothold in Africa and the confidence to look out into the unknown and build a global empire. What do you think?